We come now to the end of our fourth unit, the unit I've called the Age of Cynicism and Suspicion. I want to examine the philosophical contribution and the thought of Karl Marx. Marx himself is a transitionary figure in the sense that even as he reaches beyond the end of the 1800s and into the contemporary and postmodern era, there are also vestiges or leftovers of the modern Enlightenment period thinking within Marx's thought. So even as he influences the contemporary period in a number of respects, the influence is both positive and negative in the sense that it presents a foil against which other people later on, who are in various respects sympathetic with Marx's agenda, would find reason to criticize him. So Marx, let's take a minute to think about his own transition and his own philosophical development. Marx transitioned from his early studies in philosophy to a study of politics, of economics, and later on into revolutionary politics, revolutionary activity throughout his life. I want to begin with his early philosophical development to see how his later political and economic development sort of emerged out of that. Marx, when he was studying philosophy as a young man, wrote a dissertation on Democritus and Epicurus. You'll remember that Epicurus and Democritus were both ancient Greek atomists who saw the world as being composed of material atoms or corpuscles, and understood the history of the world as being explicable by the aggregation of these atoms, which aggregated themselves together by way of random or chancy swerves. So history isn't really teleological. It's not going anywhere in particular, but it is composed fully of material bits and pieces. In addition to that, during the time period in which Marx was developing his own philosophical outlook, the Hegelian philosophy was in the ascendancy, especially in Germany, but in other areas on the continent as well. Hegel also provides a kind of overall picture of what the world is like and how history marches forward, which was quite different from what the ancient Greek atomists had thought. He is more of an idealist, seeing the world as somehow being constructed out of the categories of human thought, and he sees the catalyst for change as being essentially a series of theses, antitheses, and then syntheses. So he provides a kind of mechanism of change which allows us to see the world in evolutionary terms and gives us the idea that history is sort of inexorably marching onward and upward, but he does it in a way that is antithetical to the kind of materialist outlook that Marx had studied by way of the ancient Greeks and which Marx himself was drawn to. So Marx thinks of the world as being a material place and human beings as being material entities. He doesn't have room for souls. There's no God or gods in Marx's picture. However, he did criticize the ancient materialists for not investing human beings and human nature into the story of world history in the way that they ought to have done. It looks as though Hegel has done this. Hegel's got room for the intellectual contributions, the ideas that lead to ideologies, that lead to social structures and so forth. And he sees the human being as occupying a role in this story, but it's a role of a very sort of intellectualist bent. For Marx thinks that this puts the human being in the sort of passenger or passive role much too much. Indeed, he memorably said that, the philosophers so far, all they've done is interpreted the world. The point is to change it. And so he sees himself in his role as a philosopher and as a thinker as providing a kind of extension of what human beings do in general in the way in which world history marches forward, the way that they provide the catalyst, the engine of change. So How does Marx see world history marching onward? What is his picture of the way in which history develops through time? Well, for Marx, human beings, human nature in its capacity as producer enters into the story here. For Marx, human beings do have an essence. They have a nature. But instead of thinking of them as being sort of, rational animals, as Aristotle would say, or descriptions along those lines, Marx thinks of the human essence as being that of a producer, that of a worker, a maker, a builder, and sees human nature as being essentially mutually dependent, right? So you're a producer and you live in community. You have a communal nature. Even if it's something that goes rather unrecognized by us, we still, nevertheless, are situated within a very vast network of social and political relationships with one another. We depend upon one another, not only for material goods and so forth, but even for human flourishing. So he wants to insert human nature so understood into the story of history and remain a materialist in doing so. So he creates the vision of the world, which has come to be called historical or dialectical materialism. This is the 1800s was a time period that was marked by a sort of fascination with the notion of evolution. And the notion of evolution was, in some respects, Panglossian, in the sense that it was seen to be, again, going forward in an upward and onward way, where history is going eventually to get better and better and better. He thinks that, again, human beings play a role with respect to the engine that forces this change. And the underlying substructure is something that is economical in nature, right? So the structural cause for the onward progression of human history and of human society is the creation of these social structures which will, by degrees, further the potential for human beings to exercise and develop their productive powers, but then will come to a point where they actually end up impeding the exercise of those very powers until, by way of the catalyst of class structure and so on, another social formation arises in which our productive powers, our essence, right, becomes more fully realized, but then there's another impediment until, again, it's overthrown, and we finally move along the stage from where we were at the time, industrial capitalism, to communism. So he sees the world is headed somewhere good. It's going to end up in a sort of communist utopia. And right now, we're not in the situation we wish to be. The human nature that Marx describes is, again, a human nature that's got sort of dual aspect. We are essentially producers, and we are essentially mutually dependent. The catalyst for change from an industrial capitalism to communism, which is where human destiny is headed, is going to come by way of an awakening of the exploitation undergone by the proletariat or working class at the hands of the bourgeoisie, who are the holders of capital and, more generally speaking, the holders of power. So, what happens in an industrial capitalism is your nature is essentially hindered from being fully expressed in your work and in your mutual relationships. That's because it's really the capitalist that owns the value of your labor. You become alienated from yourself in an industrial capitalist society because you become a sort of cog or wheel in the greater industrial machine and are therefore alienated from the work of your hands. In addition to that, there are a series of sort of economic barriers and social barriers that stand between you and those people who become the beneficiaries of your own production. So you don't have the satisfaction that comes from being a maker, being a creator, and seeing to it that the mutual dependence within which we all live as human beings, seeing to it that that mutual dependence has been fostered by your work, since somebody benefits from you even as you benefit from them. So this societal structure has the effect of pulling us apart from one another, alienating us from one another, and alienating us from ourselves. There's a couple ways that we have tried historically to meet this problem that we all sort of feel in our bones, this alienation that we all are in some sense cognizant of. One way to do that is by way of religion, right? So what you do when you set up a kind of religious institution or religious social structure is you kind of place a substitute for the full expression of human nature and human potential by telling yourself that, well, in here anyway, in the eyes of God anyway, we're all equal, even though we know that when it comes to your material, economic, social reality, you are somewhere along the hierarchy of classes, and the great majority of people are there towards the exploited bottom. So religion gives you this false sense of equality that you don't really possess and can be used at the hands of the bourgeoisie, the ruling classes, can be used to sort of placate the workers into a kind of acquiescence, to a kind of submission of their exploited condition. So famously, Marx remarks that religion is the opiate or the opium of the people, lulls you to sleep with these false illusions about how, well, things are bad now, but in the end, God will put things to rights. In this life, there's injustice. In the next life, things will be fine. That is simply a story used by the powerful in order to keep those without power down and in their exploited condition. Same thing holds true, the same general recipe for maintaining these exploitive practices holds true even in classically liberal democracies. In this sort of arrangement, you're thinking of yourself as being equal in the eyes of the law as opposed to equal in the eyes of God, even though, of course, socially, economically, and in many other respects, you are unequal. This again gives you a false sense of equality, a false sense of human achievement and potential, and ends up impeding, again, the full development of human productive power. This is why, for Marx, it's inevitable that the lower classes are going to wake up at some point, unite at some point, and throw off in some way or other the yoke that has been holding them back. It's going to have to involve an overthrow of this sort of industrial capitalist way of doing business and land itself eventually in a communist utopian society in which there is genuine equality, in which, each person can produce in accordance with their abilities, and each person is given to in accordance with their own needs. So, although, of course, Marx is not going to give us a sort of eschatological vision of, life after death, ultimate meaning, and so forth, he does give us a way of understanding the human destiny that we are on the path of currently and how and why we should attempt to achieve it. I mentioned a moment ago that Marx exerts a considerable influence over the way that we think even today. I don't need to argue for Marx's impact on 20th century politics, the great social experiments within Europe, political experiments within Europe and elsewhere. Those are obvious enough. But I want to point out something a little bit more subtle as well, that speaks to a kind of Marxist influence. And that is just over the culture at large, right? I mean, the Marxian way of doing business, of seeking underlying causal structures beneath the surface, of things, leads to a kind of hermeneutics of suspicion that has become very familiar to us in art, in culture, in literary criticism, and so on. We're used to hearing people express their justifications for their own ideologies, for their own social practices. We're also used to being cynical and suspicious, thinking that they're telling themselves and ourselves stories that are allegedly justificatory stories about these practices, but in reality, they only mask a more insidious underlying motivation, which is always going to be analyzable in terms of a class struggle between the exploited and the exploiters, the powerful. This is the case with respect to analyses of gender relations, analyses of sexual orientation, virtually any literary analysis in religion or in under a secular guise can be given this kind of analysis after taking up a posture of hermeneutics of suspicion. One final thing that I'd like to say, though, about Marx that'll sort of set us up for a criticism of Marx that would come through others who are in large part sympathetic to him, is that, as secular, as materialistic and atheistic as Marx's historical dialectical materialism is, it still has an unmistakably religious flavor to it, right? I'm not going to say there are religious elements, but it's got a religious flavor in the sense that it provides such a comprehensive, controlling kind of meta-narrative over history. And it's hard not to see that, within this history, you don't have divine providence. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the universe is headed somewhere blindly or randomly. There's still a kind of teleological or goal-directed flavor to this historical progression, leading as it does to a kind of climax in this utopian communism. Original sin is done away with, but, there's something that substitutes for original sin. You still get the same sense of alienation from yourself, from other human beings, but this time given by Marx's analysis of the essence or nature of human beings. And that's in fact the last thing to keep in mind as we push on to the 20th and 21st century, is that Marx does, in fact, unabashedly give us a story about human nature, telling us what human beings are by their essential nature like, and finding a way to fit them within world history, telling us a story about what we should aim for or strive to become within it. These things, the notion of a goal-directed process headed inexorably somewhere good or better, the notion of a stable human nature which we can understand and which fits into the story of human history. All of these are going to come under greater and greater degrees of scrutiny and suspicion in the upcoming centuries.